Hi, shalom, friends. It's amazing what a little prejudice could do. You know, when sometimes I will observe, let's say, a group of children acting out, and I might think to myself, they're really acting out. In fact, so-and-so is really quite obnoxious. And then, if I happen to notice that one of those kids is my own child, suddenly I reinterpret the sight. After all, if it's my kid cannot be obnoxious. This actually happened, I believe there was a PTA meeting where 5, 6 parents met with the teacher privately, and then they were asked to sit together as a group. And the teacher brought up, he said, I will not mention names, but there is a student of mine that seems to have a very disruptive attitude, not only towards me, but actually is creating havoc in the classroom. She's very disrespectful, and people are learning from her. And as she mentions it, she asks the different parents, what do you think I should do? And the consensus was that you should have her expelled because she's just simply not good for the class. And then the teacher mentioned, oh, I didn't say the name, so let me say the name. And she happened to mention the daughter of one of those parents. She became very flustered, and she said, 1 second, I think we're a little bit hasty. Perhaps we could try this, perhaps we could try that. Amazing what a little prejudice could do. If it's someone else's child, then it seems to be very clear what to do. And if it means coming down on the side of justice, you do so. But if it's your child, there is this idea of, well, if it's my child, it's almost instinctive and natural that they must be something good. So when we use the expression, so-and-so has a face or personality that only a mother could love, I'm not sure how it was originally said, but that's actually true. Sometimes the only way a person could find something of redeeming value is if you could find yourself in that person, and of course parents often do that with their children. I say this because we are told in this week's Torah portion that we are commanded to love a fellow Jew like ourselves. And you say, what, love a fellow Jew like ourselves? How can I? This, my neighbor or the person that I know, is not a very nice person at all. As a matter of fact, they're worse than not being a nice person. I don't want them in my house. And here God says you should love a fellow Jew like yourself. And you start looking through the commentaries, maybe you could find some exceptions to the rule, like your neighbor who keeps you up, and the guy across the hall who's quite rude and doesn't hold the elevator for you, stuff like that. But when you look at the commentators, you really can't find exceptions. And you say, how is it possible that Hashem should give us such a command to love a fellow Jew? And to love a fellow Jew with such intensity that as you would want yourself to be treated, so you should treat your fellow Jew. Well, one answer that comes to mind immediately is it's hard to love a stranger. Or some would argue cynically, it's easier to love a stranger because you don't know the person. But when it comes to your own family, you don't have to actually be told to love them. What you're told actually to do is be reminded that this is your family. So in a sense, when we say love a fellow Jew like yourself, indirectly Hashem is saying, this is your brother, this is your sister. Now I want you to interpret, if necessary, their actions through the perspective that this is my brother, this is my sister. Rabbi Shalom Schwarden, of blessed memory, tells a story that happened with him. I don't remember the year. I think it was in the 1920s in Jerusalem, and it was on the Shabbat, and a child fell and hit on his head some stone. It began to bleed. Now, many of you that know about flesh wounds, even on the skull, it just looks a lot worse than it really is. But it's pretty scary when you see blood coming from the hair area or whatever. So when the kid began to cry, they shout, Yankel is hurt, or whatever. What happened was that Rabbi Schwarten ran out of the house. He was wearing his shirt sleeves. He was not wearing his hat and his jacket, which was more of a formal way to be seen in public on the Sabbath. And he took a towel and he quickly ran to the child, put the towel next to the blood, and then picked up the child and ran towards the doctor. Of course, he's a sight because he was a middle-aged rabbi, always known to be, dignified. You never saw him running, and you never saw him running on the Sabbath, and you never saw him running on the Sabbath in his shirt sleeves. So there was a lady that lived across the courtyard, and when she saw the rabbi holding a child, and she could see that there was a towel, she says, Zog sich nicht, Gott wird helfen, don't worry, Hashem will help. And of course, he has no time to chat, so he continues running. As he's running, she notices closer, as he gets closer, she notices that it's her grandchild. And then she began to shriek, oh, Yankala. And of course, Rabbi Schwarten never stopped. He ran with the kid to the doctor, but he often repeated the story. When it's someone else's child, don't worry, Hashem will help. If it's your child or your grandchild, you lose it. Oh, what's going to be? It's about time we started to look at one another as this is my brother, this is my sister, this is my first cousin, and this is my relative. It's so strange that many of our enemies have identified all Jews as being part of the same family. And yet Jews amongst themselves will sometimes look disdainfully at a fellow Jew. The Hasidic movement, when it was instituted, took the commandment. It's not a new commandment. It's one of the 613 biblical commandments of loving a fellow Jew as yourself, but it added a tremendous amount of depth to it. And number one, it expanded the scope, and obviously, too, it expanded in depth. Let me tell you what I mean by expanding the scope. The same way a Jew is obligated to believe in God, whether he's living in Israel or Uganda, and the same way a Jew is obligated to put up a mezuzah, whether he's living in Moscow or he's living in Yemen. A Jew is obligated to love a fellow Jew wherever that fellow Jew might live, even if you never met him. Could you imagine? You have a commandment, you who are listening to this YouTube, have a commandment to love a Jew wherever they might. If you're Jewish, you have that commandment. You have a brother or a sister who you might never meet. And you are obligated to feel a sense of kinship and a sense of closeness, and indeed to be motivated to love. In fact, if we go even deeper, there are certain people that live in their own world. We all know that there are special children that it's hard to relate to them because they're in their own world. There are those that have chosen to create a different reality. Actually, certain people who are homeless might actually tell you they've chosen that way of life. And in your understanding, that's no life at all. Not knowing where to eat, to bathe, or to sleep. And yet they're in a different world, in a different mindset. What is the mindset of a Jew? At the very least, to keep the Ten Commandments. At the very least, to have allegiance and pride in his heritage. At the very least, to acknowledge that there's a God and a Torah and a history. What would be about a Jew who's in a different world? Who denies, and he says, the Jews are not a religion, it's a culture. I don't like this culture, I don't like the matzo balls, and I don't like the Yiddish. I have nothing in common with the shtetl or with the Bible. About God, I reserve judgment. You say, man, you're in a different world. But you know something? When the Torah says you shall love your fellow Jew as yourself, it doesn't say if he's in your world. It seems to imply in any world where there is a Jew, even if you never meet this person physically, or emotionally, or spiritually, you still should love him. Why should you love him? Because if you had a twin brother that you never met, was given up for adoption, or through other reasons who you never saw, when you would see that twin brother, you should feel that this is my brother. And my likes and dislikes can probably be reflected in this person's life as well. During these days, when we're in quarantine and there's a lot of anxiety about the future, we have to be reminded again and again we are not alone. We are with God. We have an extended family. And I have family that loves me that I never met. And I have family that loves me that I could rely on if it ever came to it. We are in this all together, not only humanity, but Jews in particular. What we have to do is strengthen not only our faith, but our love to one another and to God. Thank you.